Oh, I'm on. That's what we call live television, folks. Welcome to Business Skills for the Modern Creator, Session 2, which maybe should focus on on-camera etiquette, but we'll save that for another business skills. But regardless, welcome to those of you joining us here in Fort Lauderdale or from around the country or around the world, wherever you may be. This is Business Skills for the Creatives, Session 2. It's a continuation of our award-winning 2020 series, which brought artists during the pandemic a way to bring out their creative aspirations, work on developing a lot of their vision, life and business skills related to their art and becoming a successful business. This is the second workshop of our 2021 series. And while the other workshops are not prerequisites, you can always go back on our YouTube channel for the upcoming sessions or the previous sessions and check them out. Our last session covered how to apply for grant funding as an artist, and our upcoming sessions include creative placemaking for a stronger community and the art of negotiation. So please check those out and be sure to sign up for them. Just a quick reminder that this session is being recorded. So after the session, you can go on our YouTube page and check it out. I also do want to mention that closed captioning is available. So if you need closed captioning, you can go down below and turn that on. I do have to remind you that it is on whatever platform you choose, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. So it might be different depending on how you're accessing the stream. So today we're going to be speaking with Elaine Grogan Luttrull and discussing financial strategies post-pandemic, which of course is a very timely topic. Elaine is the founder of Minerva Financial Arts, a company devoted to building financial literacy and empowerment in creative individuals. Elaine partners with funders, including Creative Capital, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the Tamarack Foundation, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation to provide ongoing support for recipients of these awards. Elaine teaches at the Columbus College of Art and Design, where she served as department head for business and entrepreneurship from 2014 to 2018. And previously, Elaine served as the director of financial analysis for the Juilliard School and the transaction advisory services practice of Ernst & Young in New York. So Elaine is also the author of Arts and Numbers. She's based in Columbus, Ohio, where she serves on the boards of the Short North Alliance and Healing Broken Circles. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Elaine. Elaine, how are you?
Hi, Phil. I'm fantastic. How are you?
You know, it's a hot day here in South Florida in Fort Lauderdale, but we are in the air conditioning and happy to be here and happy to have you here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Actually, right before I turn it over, I want to remind our audience that we're going to be taking questions at a few different points throughout the presentation. So if you have questions, you can save them for those places that we will be taking questions, or you can put them in the chat. And I've got a great team of folks here. You can't see them because they're on the other side of the camera, but they're writing down your questions and we'll be addressing them at that time. So whether you put them in now or put them in when we take questions, keep those questions coming. So Elaine, I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll see you in just a second.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Phil. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. As Phil said, my name is Elaine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you from Columbus, Ohio, where it is a little more mild than it might be in South Florida today. And this is indigenous Kashkoshki and Hopewell cultural lands. In case you're listening instead of watching, I will share a visual description of myself. I am a 40-ish-year-old white female with wavy, blondish, brownish hair, and I'm wearing a silver top and a black jacket today. So let's kind of dive into what we're talking about today. We have some slides that are going to be showing up on the screen. Here's where I get to acknowledge all the amazing partners I work with, because I really am the absolute luckiest money person of all time. So let's dive into the content. We have kind of three main sections for today. And as we're going through these three sections, I want to take a second just to acknowledge a couple of ground rules. Phil mentioned the comment section. Please make sure your questions are being heard. So put those questions in the comment box so we can get to as many of them as possible. And also let's make sure we're making room for everyone's voices to be heard. And I also want to point out that we are all equal parts teachers and learners in this space. So that means you get to decide what to do with this information and how it can best serve your own creative practice, both in this moment and then after our time together ends, as you continue reflecting on some of this content and figuring out what it means for you. And then lastly, although this is being recorded, I do want to remind you that stories need to probably stay within this space, although by all means take the lessons from any stories that are shared and carry those lessons with you. In terms of our three content areas, we can go to the next slide now. Our three goals are to think about what it means to really redefine your creative value. So we'll spend some time diving into something called a unique value proposition, which, by the way, can help you with those grant requests that you may have worked on in session 1 and help you forge those community partnerships in session 3. We'll also talk about the portfolio career framework, including brainstorming different opportunities that might be available to you, especially now, and we'll look at some data there. And then thirdly, we will spend some time looking very specifically at expenses, including some new expenses that may have come up for you as your practice has changed over the past 18 months or so. Next slide. So with that, part one. What do you do? Our goal here is to redefine your creative value proposition. Next slide. So when someone asks you the question, what do you do? Very often we answer with a noun. We say, I'm an artist, I'm a writer, I'm a musician, I'm an accountant. But that doesn't really capture the value of what we do. Essentially, that's what you put on your tax form. Next slide. At the other end of the extreme, sometimes we give an entire artistic statement or lots of information about our qualifications and our history. But that's probably too long. It's too much information, and it's really only interesting to other creative individuals that are deeply enmeshed in this world. Next slide. So what we're looking for is kind of this middle zone between those two extremes. And in entrepreneurial terms, we call this a unique value proposition. It gives more information than a single noun, and it shares some of the real value that you do beyond that noun. But it's the beginning of a conversation. It doesn't have to include absolutely everything. Next slide. However, this term, unique value proposition, sometimes can be a little hard to deal with. It feels very businessy and very entrepreneurial and not at all creative. So let's just break down each of these words. The first word is unique. So what makes you different or special? Value, the second word, is what do you do to change the world? How does your work impact yourself, your family, your community, your country? And the proposition piece is how you are going to do what you do for those you serve. Next slide. So as we think about these terms individually, it's a little bit easier to see how this might relate to the creative arts. And it's really important to think about these terms as they apply right now. The things that make you unique probably haven't changed, especially over the past 18 months or so. If anything, you've probably built even more skills to support your creative practice. But what you do and how you do what you do may have shifted. You might be doing virtual studio visits or virtual performances, or you may be performing to smaller groups of individuals. So thinking about the context of what you do and how you do it can help you really get a clear sense of how your unique value proposition has changed and how it has not changed. Next slide. So this is a moment for a quick activity. As you know, you probably got in advance and also at the beginning of our time together today, a link to some activities and some additional reading and things to think about long term. So go to page 1 of that PDF file. It is fillable if you want to type in it. If you're like me and like to print it out, that is perfectly fine too. But there's a section at the bottom of page 1 that asks you to focus on this unique word. So the things that make you the most special, capable person of doing what you do. These are your creative strengths, your technical strengths, your personal strengths, your professional strengths, anything like that that makes you the artist that you are. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds. That is not a lot of time. And your job is to list as many of your own strengths as possible in that box on page 1. On your mark, get set, go. About 20 more seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Stop. Now, hopefully you have a lot of things listed, but sometimes it can be really challenging to list our own strengths. So this is where you can really tap into the expertise of those who know you well to help identify some of those strengths. And I'd encourage you to keep focusing on this list, especially as we continue building out that unique value proposition. Also, if you're so inclined, feel free to drop a couple of your strengths into the comment section. I imagine we'll see some pretty fantastic ones there. And you may even see someone that lists a strength that you might lack, so that could be an opportunity for collaboration as well. Next slide. The next part of this is to think about strong, impactful verbs that capture the value of what you do. Feel free to jot a few down as I'm speaking, but what we're looking for here are really strong action words. So maybe you empower, or maybe you disrupt, or maybe you change someone's perspective through your creativity. Or maybe you amplify a narrative that hasn't been told. These are all the powerful words we're thinking about that go beyond I paint, I make, I write, because there's so much more value contained in what you do beyond a rather simple verb. So I challenge you to go ahead and jot down what some of those verbs are. You don't have to decide on your verb right now. And in fact, you don't even have to pick one, but focus on building that list out so that we can continue building out your unique value proposition. Next slide. This third piece, the proposition piece, is how you do what you do for those you serve. So this is where we really kind of connect what you do, right? So the idea of disrupting environments by sharing large-scale installations, or changing the narrative of stories that are told, right? That's that sort of third piece, this proposition piece that explains a little bit more the how of what you do. And oftentimes we use words here like by, or through, or for, if you want to highlight who you serve. And so those words can kind of help you get started as you think more about this how piece. Next slide. So if we pull these pieces together, what makes you different are your strengths, right? Your skills, the things that make you who you are. Your value is your what, or for whom you serve, what you do to change the world. And the proposition piece is how you do it. Next slide. So we pull these pieces all together and form them into essentially a short declarative sentence that could be the first line of your grant application. It could be the first line of your bio on your website, or it could be part of your Instagram description. So this is what we're building to, a short declarative sentence that highlights you, what you do with that strong action verb, and how you do what you do. Next slide. Here are a couple of examples from individuals I've worked with over the years, and I will share these unique value proposition statements did not start here. This is where they ended up after a lot of editing and some brainstorming and some tweaking. So this first one I really love. I disrupt the expected environment with large-scale paintings and installations. That's really powerful. That is much more powerful than someone sharing, I make big art, right? It's so much more interesting to capture the disruption of the space that this artist intends to accomplish, right? It's so much more powerful because that's the real value of what they do. When you walk into a hotel lobby, you are disrupted by their art in a really powerful way. I'll also note that this is a first person sentence. I disrupt the expected environment, but it doesn't have to be. If you were using this somewhere else, you could put your full name instead of I if you wanted to make it a third person sentence, and that's perfectly fine as well. Next slide. Here's another example I love. I explore racial and gender binaries through introspective documentary photography and video. That's powerful. It's more powerful than saying, I'm a photographer. This sentence is capturing the real value of the person's art above and beyond saying, I'm a photographer. And that's really important. I will also tell you, we went back and forth a lot on the phrase introspective documentary photography. Personally, I thought it was too many syllables, but guess what? It's not my unique value proposition. The artist felt very strongly that introspective documentary photography was an important phrase that needed to be in there. And that's okay. The artist is allowed to use whatever words really capture them, including words that might feel a little more nuanced or a little more scaled back, right? So there's a nice balance of finding the words that capture you and do articulate your value, but also feel like something that you would say or write. So there has to be that authenticity in there as well. Next slide. I surprise students by combining Lady Gaga and Bach. This is one of my favorites because this is a music educator, but that doesn't capture the real value of what they do, which is teaching students the fundamentals of composition and why students can rock out to Bach in the same way they can to Lady Gaga, because the fundamentals of many of the music are the same. And that's really cool to be able to surprise students, especially elementary school students in a music education class, is powerful. And that captures the value of this music educator above and beyond simply saying, I teach children about music. That is really important. But this unique value proposition tells me more about what this person really does and how they're changing the world through their creativity. Next slide. So, when are you supposed to use this? Really anytime. I've mentioned a couple of examples. It could certainly live on your website. Maybe it's a header, maybe it's a footer, maybe it sort of is a pull-out call quote somewhere. It could live on your website. If you have any sort of, I'll call it branding materials, it could live there. So maybe you have, this phrase that goes at the bottom of your headshot, or maybe you have your CV, or a resume or a bio that you share regularly with groups that engage you. You could include it there. Maybe you include it in conversations with funders or in grant applications. You could even think about taking your unique value proposition and going through the exercise of writing a unique value proposition for a project you want to do. This project will change the narrative of this neighborhood in South Miami, or this project will empower individuals to see themselves in a new light, or something like that. You can use this same framework to bump up and amplify your grant applications so that you can then secure funding to do more of the work you want to be doing. You could also use this at cocktail parties or networking events or opening receptions. I have here at the grocery store as well. You can absolutely use it at the grocery store. And this is a little tongue in cheek because in some ways, this is supposed to be easy enough to roll off your tongue so that you could naturally use it at the grocery store. And then at the same time, if you see your neighbor at the grocery store, you're probably not going to say, hello, neighbor, I disrupt environments with large installation paintings, right? So there's sort of a natural authenticity that comes from this, but also an awareness of contextually when it makes sense to use it. And it's important to emphasize that this is the start of a conversation. The second piece of this can be, and now I'm working on ... or I'm interested in exploring ... or I'm hoping to secure funding for ... right? This is the start of the conversation, not the end of one. And this can be used as you think about what your next steps might be, especially in the context of emerging from this pandemic in a way that might be different from how your creative practice looked at the start of it, which means you can use this as you grapple with hard things. So speaking of hard things, I'm wondering if there are some questions or some comments that it makes sense to review together. Phil, how are we doing? Do we have any comments or questions to review?
I've got some as the team is sort of looking through the comments. I think I figured out my value proposition. I think I disrupt my staff members' lives by creating more work for them. Maybe that's not okay. I think I have some more work to do on my value proposition, but sorry, I got
there's some pretty brilliant leadership ethos embedded in that, I think, Phil.
We've got one from our friend Laura Sue, the Silver Nightingale. Can you suggest some more action words?
Yes. Oh, Laura Sue, great question. I really like empower. I like amplify. I like disrupt. Let's see. Sometimes what people have been doing is they'll start with just a brainstorm. So make, create, identify, uncover, unleash. We could probably keep going, but then think about leaning into your favorite thesaurus, whether it's an online thesaurus or something else. The idea of, really kind of playing around with some of those stronger verbs. I see in your image, is that an instrument there, perhaps?
It's a
Phil
flute,
is the musician.
and I'm not sure what the other instrument is, but I know Laura Sue is a flautist and
Excellent.
a ukulele player, if I remember correctly.
That's amazing. With that, the idea of leaning into kind of an audio verb could be interesting. Maybe you surprise people with compositions. Maybe you, I don't know. I keep coming back to disrupt, but maybe you soothe them with your music or something like that. So thinking about, what's the output of your performance, or how do you want people to feel after your performance or a class with you or listening to your composition, right? How do you want them to feel? And then turning that into an action verb could be a good next step.
I want to touch on before we move on the concept and idea of uniqueness, because I think a lot of, I'm a pianist, I'm an artist as well. You always sort of struggle with uniqueness, because when you sit down and at least on the surface of it, you think about what are my unique qualities, and sometimes we have a habit of identifying things that we think are unique, but really are kind of average when you get into it. So what's your advice for someone that struggles with coming up with that uniqueness, that is really struggling to identify what makes them unique?
Oh, that's a great question. I love getting feedback from other people, because whether it is your customer or a client or an audience member, they can sometimes reflect upon you what they really love about what you do. And sometimes that's the unique piece. So the idea of kind of just listening to what other people are sharing with you about your work. If you're a visual artist and you have access to hear what people say as they're wandering through one of your exhibitions, or if you're a performer and you ask someone just to listen in the audience to hear what people say during intermission, right? There are moments where you can sort of capture that directly and indirectly. Or if it's earlier in your career and you don't necessarily have access to clients or customers or other individuals to provide that feedback, or that you would be comfortable asking for that feedback from, you can ask your peers or your instructors or your mentors, because sometimes they have insights into what really is special about what you do above and beyond technique and capability and other things that might feel like everyone can do them.
And I suppose a good way to ask your friends or colleagues, if you've got a good social media presence, Facebook or Instagram, is to actually ask, those that follow you or those you're connected with on your digital platforms to weigh in about, hey, what makes me unique?
Absolutely. Yeah. You could even make it even more creative than that. You could say, what's the first word you think of when you hear my music? Or what's the first image that comes to mind when, you see my work or something like that. And you could then tease out some common themes from that feedback.
Well, knowing my friends, that would be a dangerous question to ask. So
It's
I'll
completely
give some
fair.
more thought on that. I'm going to ask my team, do we have any more questions? We do have another question here. So for people who may not know what a certain art form like video project mapping entails, would it be better to say augmenting reality with video and light, or something more simple?
Oh, Marcel, this is an amazing question. And it gets at really the key of this, which is knowing who you're speaking to. So if you are speaking to, let's say, a potential collaborator who might be really familiar with projection mapping, right? Video projection mapping, maybe then you say, I video projection map. That's probably not the most exciting verb to use, but the phrase, I augment reality with video and light, that's so powerful. And that's something that a family member not in the arts could probably understand. A funder who's a couple of steps removed from the technical aspects of art could understand. And it leads to a really natural follow-up where I want to know more. You augment reality with video and light, tell me more. And then there's an opportunity to continue in the conversation or the grant application. So absolutely, Marcel, know thy audience in being clear about how you're communicating with them what you do.
And we've got one more question before we move on from Tanya. I'm a soft sculpture artist, AKA a hand needling fabric, excuse me. Which one would read better?
Oh, great question. I think soft sculpture artist, I like the way that sounds as Phil said it out loud. There's some alliteration there, and soft sculpture tells me about the materials you're working with. Plus, sculpture is a word that a lot of people are familiar with. So perhaps it's, I'm a soft sculpture artist who ... comforts individuals through my creations or something like that, right? So yours might be, Tanya, a yes and, but I really like soft sculpture artist. I like the way that sounds.
Yeah, I think that's a really unique way. I've never heard of art with fabric and textiles described as a soft sculpture artist. I think that's really cool. So we're going to move on to the next session, or to the next section, excuse me. Elaine, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
That sounds amazing. Thank you. Thank you all for those fantastic questions as well. As we sort of wrap up this first conversation about your unique value propositions, I will remind you that this is just the start of the conversation. You are not expected to now know exactly what you're going to say. So continue thinking about what you do, using that list of strengths, thinking about those powerful, impactful verbs. And if you like your verbs, maybe drop them into the comments so others can see what verbs you're using as well. On the second page of your handout towards the bottom, you have some reflection questions to continue to draft your unique value proposition and edit it, work with it, practice saying it in the mirror and to others, right? So that it can continue to evolve, so that you can use it to help inform some of your next choices. So again, bottom of page 2, if you want some homework or want to keep going. Next slide. Once we know what we do, that unique value proposition, then we want to know how you monetize what you do. And so now we're going to talk about portfolio careers. Next slide. This is page 7 of your handout. And this is how I think about money in the arts. It's a visual representation, but I do want to draw your attention to the money in column, because this is where we're going to be spending the next half an hour or so together. Next slide. The money in column basically identifies different sources of income you might have as a creative individual. And this probably feels familiar because we know in the arts, we often make money from a lot of different things. I like organizing those different things into something called a portfolio career. You have a portfolio for your work if you're a visual artist. You have repertoire if you're a performing artist, right? This is applying that same idea to the different ways you earn money. So your portfolio career is a framework for organizing your income, and it works best when you align your strengths with opportunities to use those strengths or monetize those strengths. Next slide. The first part of the portfolio career is my favorite. This is your starring role. This is your thing. This is what you would do if you could do anything else in the world. Perhaps you're a soft sculpture artist, or a textile artist, or a musician, or someone who soothes with compositions or unexpected compositions for the flute, right? This is your thing. It's probably pretty closely related to your unique value proposition, but it doesn't have to be only related to that, and that's okay. As you're thinking about your starring role, you want to get really clear on what it is and also maybe what it is not, so that you can get comfortable saying no to things that don't necessarily align with your starring role. And it's really important to protect your work in this area. We want to be setting appropriate rates for your work or your time. And we also want to make sure we have clarity around those yeses so that you can say yes to something on purpose instead of saying yes to something in this category because you need the money. Next slide. But that might not be enough. Or you might be someone that takes fulfillment from doing a lot of different things. I hear this from creative individuals all the time. The idea of being able to perform and then also compose, or teach and also make. The idea of being able to use different parts of your brain to support those you serve can be very appealing. So that's where this second category comes into play. Next slide. The supporting cast role is something that's related to your starring role, but it's not exactly the same thing. And when we're thinking about things in this category, we're thinking about things that might use some of the same skills, some of the same techniques, maybe some of the same equipment, but it's not exactly what you want to be doing. So let's pretend you're a nature photographer, but during the spring season, when students are graduating from high school and college, you have a pretty active studio where you take senior portraits. That's fantastic. That is a supporting cast role toward your starring role of being a nature photographer. And that is perfectly fine. You're using your expertise, maybe a strength of being very good with clients, maybe a strength of knowing how to balance lighting and help people pose, right? So you're using the same equipment, the same expertise, those strengths you have, and you're finding opportunities to monetize those strengths in service of your starring role, which is what you would be doing if you could do anything in the world. As you think about these supporting cast role categories, it's really important that you are setting appropriate rates. That was important in starring role as well. And maybe it's even more important in supporting cast role work, because we want to make sure your supporting cast role work is financially supporting your starring role work as well. We want to make sure these are lucrative enough opportunities to justify your time. But it's also important to balance that time and the income you're earning from these opportunities. In this category, it is really, really easy to keep saying yes to things that fill up practically your entire calendar, which means you no longer have any time for your starring role work. So thinking about that balance between time and money in this category is really, really important. This is true, especially if one of your supporting cast roles is teaching or being an educator. It is one of the most fulfilling supporting cast roles, or maybe even starring roles, depending on your perspective, that you could do. And it's incredible. And it is also very, very easy to spend and spend and spend more time in that category, especially now when the educators out there know as well as I do that students really need a lot of support right now. They are affected by the pandemic just like the rest of us have been. And so the idea of being aware of that, meeting your students where they are, and also being cognizant of balancing this supporting cast role so it doesn't take over your starring role is absolutely crucial. The other thing to think about in this supporting cast role category is capturing any sort of related benefits. So let's pretend one of your supporting cast role works is working at a festival. Maybe you are a visual artist and normally you show work all around the country, or you have gallery representation somewhere, but you're also very active in the creative arts community. And so if there is a spring or summer festival going on, you might work for that organization to check visual artists in, to walk around, to help them set up their booths, right? You might have some sort of part-time gig working for that festival. As you think about that, that's probably a supporting cast role work. It's connected to your main role as a visual artist. And we can think about what are those related benefits that you could be getting from that role. It's a part-time gig, so you're probably not going to have health insurance or anything like that. But you do have the opportunity to walk around and see how artists are pricing their work. So maybe there's a bit of competitor research you could do as you're thinking about and understanding the visual arts landscape that might inform your own particular practice or your work. Or maybe you notice what people are saying as they're wandering around the festival, and you're noticing what kind of booths are drawing their attention. You're essentially using this as an opportunity to do some market research. Or maybe the related benefit for you is building out a larger community of visual artists. What does it look like to identify those individuals that you really form a genuine connection with, whether they are coworkers or other artists within the space, and then actively cultivate those relationships going forward? Or maybe you look at the list of sponsors for the festival and you say, oh my gosh, this particular financial institution would be a great partner for this creative project I want to do. Is there a related benefit where you, as part of your role as an employee, can start to build those relationships with sponsors or others who are involved in this particular area? That's what I mean by these related benefits. It's kind of making sure you're really capturing all of the value in support of your starring role from these supporting cast roles. Next slide. So now I'm going to go back to that exercise we did not too long ago where you listed all of your strengths. It was on page 1, right? But now I want you to turn to page 4. Next slide. What we're going to do is look at that whole list of strengths you had, and we're essentially going to choose the ones that people might need. So what I'd like you to do, next slide, is find 3 of those strengths you listed. And they can be anything. They can be personal, professional, technical, doesn't matter. But list 3 strengths and then do an open brainstorm about anyone in your community, in the world, who needs that strength. So to take a simple example, maybe one of your strengths is brilliant color theorist, right? Maybe you recall from your education that you were really good at color theory. Who needs that strength? Well, certainly other artists, but also interior designers, architects, engineers, public art commissions, perhaps, and also random people wandering into a paint store that might need a consultation on color. That's a quick, sort of easy brainstorm about individuals or groups or companies that might need that strength. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to do that same exercise for 3 strengths of your own choosing. On your mark, get set, go. About 10 more seconds, folks. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop. This is the process for building out those supporting cast roles, right? It's starting with what you do really well and then looking for opportunities to monetize those strengths. If you have some things you're particularly proud of or you like, go ahead and throw them in the comments so that you can share some of your ideas with others and read their ideas as well. Next slide. As we're thinking about this, I want to draw your attention to some data from Americans for the Arts. They did some unbelievable research during the pandemic around the impact of the pandemic on individual artists and on arts organizations. And one of the questions they asked was, how do you get paid? And individual artists responded and reported who essentially pays them. So essentially, who is your customer? And you can see the graph on the chart that shows individual artists get paid by other individuals purchasing work, hiring them for consults, taking lessons or classes, buying tickets or admissions, right? But they also get paid by for-profit companies, both creative for-profit companies. So maybe like an architecture firm or a for-profit movie studio or something like that. But also non-creative for-profit companies. So an insurance company or a financial institution or a grocery store or a logistics company. Artists also get paid from nonprofits. Again, both creative nonprofits like a nonprofit gallery or maybe a museum or a symphony or orchestra or a writing group or a writing collective, but then also non-creative nonprofits. So think about maybe a hospital or a food bank or a social service agency. And then, of course, we have educational institutions and governmental entities, right? Individual artists make money from a lot of different types of entities as presented here. So as you go back to your list of who needs the strength you listed, it's interesting to think about where do they fall? Did you list all individuals, or maybe did you list all educational institutions? And is there an opportunity, next slide, to identify other groups that might need your strengths, right? Especially if you find yourself only serving nonprofit entities, for example. Next slide. I see a lot of opportunity, especially now, in serving individuals. So the idea that you might grow the community of individuals you serve is really interesting to me. You see, this is already an area where artists have a lot of relationships. Almost 20,000 of the artists surveyed report earning money from individuals. And it does take a long time to build up this community, right? Especially if it is a community that will provide ongoing support to you or repeat support. So maybe someone who will buy multiples of your work, or someone who might support various crowdfunding projects you might have, or even support you on an ongoing basis through something like Patreon. But I think this is an area where there's a lot of opportunity, and where, especially now, humans are really recognizing the power of the arts. Because after all, it is the arts that helped many of us survive during the pandemic. And I think there's an opportunity to really lean into that and capture that value by continuing to serve individuals. So I see a lot of opportunity there. Next slide. I also see a lot of opportunity in the non-creative, for-profit, and nonprofit space. Again, the arts have tremendous value. We all know that. I don't need to tell you that. But I think we've also seen that some for-profit companies have rebounded faster than others. So we're looking at technology companies, logistics companies, food service companies. Those companies are doing pretty well right now. So there's probably an opportunity to think about, what of your strengths do they need? Let's pretend you're a movement expert and you facilitate healing through movement exercises. Maybe you're a dancer or a choreographer. Is there an opportunity to partner with your local grocery store to offer movement classes for their employees, especially since they have been working so hard over the past 18 months or so? So these are the type of things I think it's interesting to think about. And in the context of really investing in your community, I think it's also interesting to think about the non-creative nonprofit entities within your community that could benefit from some of your strengths. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but maybe it is a pop-up musical performance at a food bank, or maybe it is sort of healing arts introduced into a hospital type of setting, right? We've seen huge growth in that area, especially now that many of the restrictions around who can be in the hospital have been lifted. So I'd be curious to hear what sort of opportunities might make sense for you there, because I think there's a lot of room for interesting partnerships there that make use of your strengths, give you those intangible benefits, and also provide a little bit of financial support in service of your starring role. Next slide. It's also possible that that's still not enough. Maybe it takes too long to cultivate those deep relationships with individuals that provide ongoing support. Or maybe you're seeking out collaborations and partnerships, but not all of them are sort of closing or moving to fulfillment. That's okay. We've got this third category of your portfolio career. The third piece is called your production assistance work. Next slide. This is the work that is not at all related to your starring role, but it still provides financial support so that you can continue pursuing your starring role. Classic examples of this tend to be things like waiting tables, or working as an administrative assistant somewhere, or as a temp in a law firm or something like that, right? So the idea that there are sources of income totally unrelated to your starring role that may still provide some really powerful benefits. Maybe it's paid time off, or maybe it is health insurance, or maybe it's infrastructure to withhold taxes and pay your taxes so that you don't have to worry about doing it quarterly. There are a lot of other unrelated benefits that can come from your production assistance work, and it's a powerful category. Next slide. So here, I wanted to take a moment to share some examples. And these are all examples of individuals I've worked with, but I've changed some of the details so that they're not fully identifiable. Next slide. This first person is a visual artist whose work is large. It retails generally for several $1,000s, and because it's important to him to make his work accessible, he also creates prints of his work. Now, they're limited edition prints, they're signed and numbered, and this is all completely on the up and up with his gallery. In fact, they love that he also does this as well. So that's a supporting cast part or supporting cast role in service of his starring role. Also, he works part-time for his city's arts council. And so he's viewed as a little bit of an insider, but also someone who is this active liaison between the community and the city arts council. So he's viewed as a leader in the field by both other makers and by the city. Again, supporting cast role in support of his starring role, creating large paintings that retail for several $1,000s. Next slide. This is an example of a literary artist who does amazing creative work, and she's created a pretty substantial following for her work online, which is pretty powerful. She has tapped into a community who really loves her and supports her work, so she self-publishes, funded through Kickstarter, and she also has ongoing supporters that pay a monthly fee to her through Patreon. And her production assistance job is actually as an attorney. And she specializes in reviewing contracts. And she kind of loves it because she works about 3 days a week doing not super stressful contract review work as an attorney. And that preserves some time for her to write. So for her, this idea of having only production assistance and starring role work is a really nice career plan. Next slide. This particular person is a graphic designer. And I think I saw in the comments, someone was saying, you know, as a graphic designer, sometimes it's really saturated. Yeah, and it is. A graphic designer, a web designer, there are a lot of individuals doing this work, right? So this particular person distinguished themselves by focusing on typography. That's kind of what they really love. So they have a really cool Instagram market, right? And occasionally that will lead to commissions, and that's fantastic, but it's not sustainable enough to be kind of their full-time thing. But it's still what they would do if they could do anything. But they also are pretty good about doing web design and logo work. And they had a friend who was in a band, so they started doing their graphic design and logo work and posters for shows and things like that. And actually that continued even during the pandemic as some of those performances turned virtual, right? And so then they would be shipping these posters for these virtual events, which was kind of interesting. And so, you know, that kind of led to a recommendation to work with another band and then another one after that, right? So this person didn't start out dreaming of making their money from band work and then doing this other cool passion project on the side, but they were able to sort of distinguish themselves by identifying a customer that they were serving, kind of on accident, but then it just kept growing and growing, and that really worked for them. Next slide. The last example here is for a performing artist. And if you are a performing artist, this might feel really familiar because this person would perform all the time if they could. And they get a couple of very small checks from royalties and licensing twice a year or so, which is lovely, but it's not yet at the point where it can fully sustain them. So they've got a regular weekly gig and they really love it because of the community of performers there, and they teach. And this particular person teaches out of her home for a handful of students and then also teaches at a preschool. So there's a lot of supporting cast role work going in there. And the balance of time is such that teaching happens during a particular time and performances happen during a separate particular time. And this person is very careful about protecting the rest of the time so that they can still take care of themselves. With that example, sort of being our final example, Phil, I'm curious if we have other questions that it might be a good time to answer.
Yes, we do have at least one question, and we can go ahead and flash that up on the screen. I do have a couple other thoughts too, if we don't have any other questions, but from Casey Lynn, for a starting out artist and business owner, what are some recommendations to further the confidence and strength in moving forward?
Oh, Casey Lynn, this is a great question. At the risk of sounding, you know, a little trite, believe in yourself, right? And also forgive yourself for learning, right? You are not expected to absolutely know everything. And as someone who's starting out, you can lean into that curiosity and vulnerability. And if you're comfortable with it, sort of share it with someone you might be working with. So let's pretend, I can't tell from your image what your our creative discipline might be, Casey Lynn, but let's pretend you're a visual artist. And let's pretend you're just starting out, and maybe you go to your favorite financial institution and you say, I'd like to open a second checking account to, capture my creative income and expenses, right? So if that's the case, maybe as part of that conversation with the teller who's opening the account for you, you say, I'm just starting out. I'm a creative individual. I love the work you have up in this financial institution. How would you feel about me dropping off some postcards or some small prints that you could add here as, a customer of your institution or something like that, right? And they might say no, but I think the more you kind of lean into that vulnerability and curiosity, the more you will build your confidence and also gain clarity around, okay, this is going to be a really good fit for me and my work, or that was kind of interesting, but I'm not going to keep doing that. And just paying attention to those lessons, especially in the first couple of years, and frankly, throughout your entire career, will help you continue to kind of know how to adjust and where to nudge.
And I think, and tell me what you think about this, but you also have to be engaged in what I would call the scene, right? So no one's going to know about your art or your practice or your business or what you do if you're not engaged. You have to go where the decision makers are, where your colleagues, your peers are, and I think that's to your point of being in those spaces and doing recon work, these kinds of things. As a jazz musician, we called it the hang. You would go where other jazz musicians play. That's how you meet people. That's how they know you. That's how when opportunities come up, they know to think about you. So there's a presence that you have to have and a consistency in that presence in that scene in order to be like, hey, I'm here. Don't forget about me.
Yes. And for someone who might be a little more introverted, that might feel like a huge challenge. But what's interesting is that you can go to a hang and find the other introverted individuals there. And it doesn't have to be going to be in sales mode, right? Like, hey, I'm Elaine, you need me to solve all of your problems. It doesn't have to be that way. It can start from these genuine human connections. And in fact, it should start from those in a way that feels really authentic to you. So maybe that's a little bit quieter, more on the edge or the fringe of the hang, right? And then just sort of being present so that individuals remember that you are there, because it's a crowded world. There are virtually no barriers to entry in opening an Etsy shop or a website or an art kind of practice. And so being present and reminding people that you do really good work is a really good way to grow your network.
And I also think diversifying, and these are your starring and supporting roles. I think is if you think about it as a portfolio of investments, it's also relating to your career. The Future of Music Coalition did some work, a study, and identified, at least for musicians, 42 possible income streams or different income streams that musicians can use. And I would assume it's similar across other disciplines to monetize your work. So it's those starring and supporting, not only the performing, but also the teaching, the composing, the money you might earn from rights or licensing or composing for film as opposed to writing jingles for commercials, those kinds of things. So we have to think outside of our starring role in order to have all those supporting roles to help support us as artists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that they came up with 42 because, as you say, they're out there. But I think some of the challenge is not filtering the bad ideas, right? Just capture them all. And then, especially if you're in, say, the first decade or so of your career, you're probably saying yes to a lot of things to identify the things that you don't want to keep doing going forward. And that is perfectly fine because we're playing a long game here, right? So you've got plenty of time to kind of figure out how this works for you.
And just one more thing before we move on. What's your advice? What is your advice to someone that does not necessarily have the luxury of saying no? You talked about saying no, and making sure we're centered and keeping focused on what our starring and supporting roles are. But if someone is just struggling to pay the bills, they may not have the luxury of saying no to those opportunities.
Right. Absolutely. And that means to me, let's find a production assistance job, right? So that is giving you that sort of stable income, right? You know that check is coming on a regular basis so that you can say no to something else, right? And that's a time balance because we all know lots of individuals have several production assistance work jobs and still don't have the ability to say no. And that just might be the phase of life you're in right now. But finding that steady source of something to take some of the financial pressure off of the next grant or the starring role or the next commission, so that if it's not a good fit for you, you can say no to it, right? That to me is where the real power of this lies. And then we could even reframe production assistance work, right? The idea that, it does have these benefits. And one of the main benefits could be stability so that you don't have to do that job in that place where you don't want to go, or you're not comfortable working with that team, or whatever it is, right? So instead of seeing production assistance work as sort of like the necessary evil of how we fund the arts in this country, all of a sudden it becomes something powerful that is returning your agency to you to make the choice about your creative work.
Yeah, it can be
So
that
for
thing
me,
that
that's the power.
enables. It can be that thing that enables your starring role to happen, and then allows it to build. So then your starring role becomes, your main sort of source of income or
Totally.
support.
And we also,
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say one final thought. This happens all the time, and we don't always talk about it. Like you think about your favorite sports star, right? Yeah, they've got a probably pretty lucrative contract, but they've also got endorsement deals, right? So they've also diversified their income in a lot of different ways. That's really powerful. So don't feel like this is something that only you have to do. Everybody's doing it.
Everybody's doing it. So we're coming up on your last section here. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, and then I'll see you for the final round of questions here in just a few minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for these fantastic questions. I'm enjoying them very much. So recapping this portfolio career section, remember, you don't have to master all of this right now, right? You can continue thinking about different things that make sense in these categories for you. And there are some reflection questions captured at the bottom of page 4 if you're someone who's motivated by some homework or some next steps. So moving right along, let's go to our next slide and kick off our third section. What does all this really cost? And so this is where we're thinking about all the expenses that go into doing what you do for those you serve, including any new expenses that may have come up over the past year, like a new subscription to a technology platform, or maybe new lighting or new microphones. There's a whole lot of new things that have probably come into your studio. Next slide. Here's where we are in this sort of framework. And I apologize. I realize, you don't have this as page 7, but we'll make sure you get a printout of this. But this is sort of the middle column here where we're going to focus on the money out. So we talked about money in, and now we're talking about money out. So let's go to that next slide. The first number I want you to think about, and you have some space to capture this number on page 5, is what does it cost you to exist as a human in the way you want to exist? Now, you can think about this number for a 1-year period, if you want to think about it that way, or you can think about it on a monthly basis. Sometimes that's a little bit easier to think about. So think about your cost to exist as a human. And by the way, that probably counts providing for your pets or your children or others you might be caring for, right? What's your cost to exist as a human in the way you want to exist? Write that number down. Next slide. After you've got that number, do the same thing for what it costs you to run your business for a year. And this is where you may have had quite a few changes over the past year. You may not have had any travel, or you may have had lots of subscriptions or other things that may have been reduced. Maybe your rent for your studio was suspended, right? All of those things are okay. But think about what it's going to cost you going forward to run your creative practice in the way you want to run it for a year. Got some space on page 5, so write down that number too. If you have no idea, that's okay. Make your best guess. Next slide. Oftentimes, we forget about some of the expenses that go into these numbers. So after this workshop, what I want you to do is take those numbers you wrote down and then check them. Go back through some of your spending history, maybe look at your tax forms for your business costs, right? And just see how close you were, because it's important for you to have a sense of what those numbers are. And we often forget about debt payments we might be making. Maybe you have a credit card bill that you are continuing to make payments on. If you have student loans, they may be in forbearance right now, so you might not be making payments on them, but that's still a cost you are going to have, especially in the next year. Maybe your insurance is something you forgot about, either because it is paid through a payroll deduction from your W-2 job, or maybe because it's something you pay once a year and it's not always top of mind as part of those monthly expenses. In terms of business costs, very often we forget about those small application fees or filing fees that add up here and there. And very often we forget about reinvesting in the business as well. Maybe you bought a new laptop last year because you were doing so much virtually. Well, your laptop is probably going to last, let's say, 3 to 5 years, or maybe longer. We can always hope. So what would it look like if you took the cost of your laptop, divided it by 5, and then reinvested that amount in your business for the next 5 years, so that 5 years from now, you've got a small pot of money to buy that next laptop? Next slide. After you've thought about sort of, I'm going to call them the obvious costs, right? So your cost to exist as a human and your cost to run your business. The next number I want you to get comfortable with is the amount you are setting aside or paying in taxes each year. So if you have no idea, that is perfectly fine. I'm going to give you some benchmarks or some starting points. If you've got what you think is a pretty good idea, write down that number on page 5. A good sort of estimate, and I'm going to call it a rough estimate, but it's a pretty good estimate, is to take 25% of your income. So remember, we did that whole portfolio career exercise, right? As you start thinking about, okay, what am I actually going to earn from those different things? We can add up all those numbers, take 25% of that, and that's a good estimate for what your tax costs might be for the year. And we're just talking income taxes here. Also, by the way, 25% is the number if you're in Florida or another state that does not have a state income tax. If you live in a state that does have a state income tax, 30% is probably a better number for you. Next slide. They have these tax calculators online. Smart Asset is a website that has great financial information, and it has one of my favorite tax calculators. There's a small screen grab of it on the slide here. And what I did was plop in some numbers for an example. Next slide. If we are someone with a $45,000 income in Broward County and we are a single tax filer, Smart Asset would estimate our taxes to be $7,157 each year. Here's the thing I need you to know about these tax calculators, though. These are designed for people who are employed by somebody else. If you are self-employed, you have to look at that FICA number. That's your Social Security and Medicare. And you have to double that, because if you are self-employed, you are both your own employee and your own employer. So you pay the entire Social Security and Medicare amount, not just half of it. So we did the math for you. Let's go to the next slide. If you are someone who's self-employed and a single tax filer in Broward County, right? Your federal income taxes might be about $3,700. We would double your FICA taxes there to be $6,886. You don't have a state or local income tax. So that means as someone who's self-employed, your total taxes would be $10,600 or so ish. And if you see, that's 23.5% of what you earned. So that's why we say 25% is not a bad estimate if you just want a quick estimate of what you might pay in taxes. Next slide. After we do that for taxes, we also want to start actively saving. And here's why I really like this approach. We've thought about all of the very real costs you have. Then we thought about your business costs. And then we thought about your tax costs. And what we're doing is essentially building up the total amount that you are going to, quote unquote, spend each year. We're not really spending our savings, but go with me here for a second. That then becomes the amount we need to earn, perhaps by exploring more supporting cast roles or production assistance work, because it is virtually impossible to save money by just cutting expenses, especially for individuals in the arts. And most of my clients are already living very lean existences. So the solution for them is not to spend less money so that then magically they can save. No, the solution is to get really clear on what your very real costs are, including those debt payments and including your taxes, and including how much you want to save so that you can then earn more money to cover all of those very reasonable expenses. In my experience, it tends to be an earning issue for most individuals rather than a spending issue. So my gentle suggestion would be to try to set aside about 20% of what you earn in short-term or long-term savings. That's a good starting point if you have no idea. If you have a more clear idea of what you actively want to save, write down that number on page 5, right? The amount you want to save each year. And that's fantastic. You can think about long-term savings, like for retirement or something else that might be further down the road, but also think about short-term savings. And I like having a balance of each of these, right? So that you are actively saving some percentage to go into your short-term savings. That's the emergency fund, essentially. But then also actively saving toward a retirement account as well. So again, 20% is a good starting point. That's a great sort of financial planner kind of number. Or you can think more deliberately about what you want to actively save and write down that number on page 5. Next slide. So we've written down numbers, and you'll check them later to see how accurate some of your numbers were, and that's okay. But I want to show you kind of what we then do with these numbers, because having the awareness is fantastic. But then there's also a way to use these numbers to plan with a bit more intention. And that's where I think some of the power really lies. Next slide. On page 6, you'll see these two columns presented next to each other. You've got your money in column, and then you've got your money out column. This is where you can write down any of those numbers you have already gathered. Once you write down those numbers, we want to add up all the money in and all the money out, and then compare. Next slide. When I usually do this with individuals, oftentimes it doesn't work right away. You'll see here, this person is planning on $45,000 in total money in and $60,000 in total money out. That is normal. That is a perfectly good place to start. We don't end there because this is not sustainable, but this is an okay place to start. But If you just kind of end here, what usually happens is someone at the end of the year will say, well, I guess I can't save any money. And then that's how they will kind of make this work. That also is not sustainable long term. So when we look at this, if we go to the next slide, we can then actively change some things here so that maybe we say, you know what, I need to spend a little bit more time pursuing that supporting cast role to make a little bit more money there. And I can cut back a smidge here or there. Maybe I'm sharing a studio space instead of having my own, or something else that doesn't really impact your creativity, so that we can bring these two columns into balance. And then we watch this throughout the year. We say, okay, how are those supporting cast roles going? How is that starring role work going? Are we kind of on track? Have we made the sales? Are we doing the gigs? What do we need to do to pursue more things, right? Because these numbers aren't set in stone. They're flexible, but we do want to make sure we're using this as a tool to plan so that we can think about things going forward that also includes savings and taxes and all of our very reasonable expenses. Next slide. That's sort of our recap for this expense section. There are those 4 categories of numbers to pay attention to: your human costs, your business costs, and then also your taxes. 25% for income taxes is not a bad estimate if you're in Florida or another state without a state income tax. 30% is a good starting point for most other states. And then how much you are going to save. And again, I like 20% or so here. And if you're paying attention to the percentages, what you're doing is basically not spending about 45% of what you're earning. If 20% of it is going to savings and 25% is going to taxes, that only leaves 55% or so to cover all of those other expenses you have. So get comfortable with these numbers, spend some more time kind of checking in with your own spending and paying attention going forward to build some intentionality around where you want your money to go. Next slide. And of course, where you want your money to go is informed by where the money comes from, that portfolio career and the diverse revenue streams you are cultivated, all informed by your unique value proposition, what you do to change the world. That UVP becomes a really important tool to inform the portfolio career opportunities that really make sense for you. And it's a powerful tool to help you remember that all of this starts with your creativity and the value you provide. And then we add some revenue and some expense pieces on top of it. And then we just keep doing it over and over and over again, because this is an ongoing iterative process. It's not a one-time thing that is done completely. Phil, how are we doing on questions? I think we have about 10 minutes left if there are questions about expenses or any other questions that have come up during this time together.
Yeah, go ahead. For those of you watching, put those questions, those last minute questions or those final questions that you have in the chat. I've got a couple things, just to get us started. A lot of the stuff that you talked about is great. And I think some folks may struggle with the amount of detail and thinking and intentionality, because you really have to sit down and plan and put pen to paper. So what are some strategies for folks that just, like me, that may not be so detail oriented in order to get started? Because otherwise it's a pretty daunting task to look at this and plan all this out.
It can be really, really daunting. Absolutely. I would say start with you and what you do best. So that means kind of picking the time of day that this works for you. If you do your best creative work first thing in the morning, that's not when you should be thinking about your numbers. Maybe you think about your numbers later in the day. Or if you're a jazz musician whose best work comes in the evening, maybe like 10 or 11 a.m. is when you think about your numbers with that morning cup of coffee as you're just getting started. But then it's also about thinking about how you work and create. If you are a sort of pen and paper kind of person, grab a notebook and just start jotting down numbers. they do not have to be perfect, right? We just wrote down numbers and then we can check them later and refine them if there were things you forgot about, and that's okay. No one is judging you for the numbers you wrote down. If you're a person that's more drawn to apps or digital tools, there are plenty you can use to get a better sense of where your numbers are going. And the benefit of that is that they often do some of the math for you, which is lovely. Your credit union or financial institution probably has some summary tools and an app that will summarize information for you. Or if in your practice you're using, Wave or Xero or QuickBooks or another system like that, you can, click a few buttons and run a report to see what your business spending has been for a period of time. And that can be an interesting way to not obsess over it, but just get some ish numbers to gut check if you're setting aside enough for taxes and for savings and capturing all your expenses. Because then we can think about really capturing that value on the revenue side.
And so it sounds like that, a lot of the work is done up front to sort of build out the tracking sort of system. And once you get it, then it's about just the monitoring and making, adjustments. So you front load a lot of that work in order to have a lot less work and stability and consistency, after that.
Absolutely. And if the idea of front loading it is too overwhelming, especially if you're just starting out, maybe for you, front load doesn't mean, setting up a full QuickBooks systems. Maybe that means setting aside 2 hours every month to look back on the month before and everything you spent, right? It doesn't have to be fancy, but that's one way you could start kind of building the habit of monitoring and getting curious about your money. And then at some point, it's going to make sense to build out maybe a more comprehensive system, and then you can explore what those look like. But don't let sort of a perfect system be the barrier to just getting curious.
And kind of on that idea of consistency, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but what are some thoughts or strategies on how to save and approach this work with consistency, recognizing the reality that with artists, a lot of times these income streams are anything but consistent and reliable?
They are the opposite of consistent and reliable. And they're the opposite of that in a good year, let alone a crazy pandemic year and then a crazy emerging from a pandemic year. So one of the things I like, let's pretend we've gone through the exercise and you know that you're saving 20%, you are setting aside 25% of everything you earn for taxes, and then, 30% is going to your business and 25% is going to your personal costs, right? If you have that, you can almost set up, I'm going to call it a rule for yourself. So let's say you do a gig and you get paid $2,000. All of a sudden, 20% of $2,000 is $400. So that's what you're going to save. And then you start kind of applying those rules, not to your paycheck, because you're not getting one of those, but instead you're applying those rules to when you get these unexpected payments or one-off type of payments. And you can do that whether you are a visual artist selling work, you can do that if you're a musician. You can sort of get a sense of these percentages so that when you get paid, kind of what to do with the money so that by the end of the year, you have already built up some savings. It's not in that active moment needing to figure out how all of a sudden you're going to save a bit. And then it's also about forgiving yourself, because let's pretend you get that check and you're supposed to put $400 of it in savings, but your rent is due and you really need to pay that rent. That's okay. Forgive yourself. Pay your rent, right? And then next time you get paid, remember, I'm definitely going to set aside 20% of this check, or maybe 25% if I can swing it to make up for what I didn't save before. Because this is a process. It's about forgiving yourself and then sticking with it over time.
Right. And to your earlier point, it is we're playing the long game here. It's doing the work and putting in the consistency to really set up a really solid future, for yourself and whoever else in your life. Right.
Absolutely.
So, team, do we have any other questions or anything additional? All right, no questions over here. Elaine, any last thoughts you want to leave the audience with before I give my wrapping statements?
I would say be patient with yourself. Keep focusing on what you do well. It always comes back to the art. This is the most important thing. Keep doing that well. Keep doing it. Keep showing up. Keep being part of the hang, metaphorically or physically. And then get curious about those other opportunities to monetize what you do so that those percentages are easier to adhere to. Because if you have some pretty consistent supporting cast role work coming in, even if it's not your dream scenario, before you know it, you will have built up a little bit of a cushion that can give your starring role a little bit more breathing room.
Well, thank you, Elaine. I think this has been a very helpful session. We've had some great questions, a lot of great comments from our viewing audience. So thank you very much. I hope it's a great day in Columbus, Ohio, and one of my favorite cities. And of course, the Columbus Jazz Orchestra with Byron Stripling. Byron's a great friend of mine, and we love those guys up there. So thank you for all the work and everything that you do, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
And to those of you viewing, I want to thank you on behalf of the Broward County Cultural Division. We've got a great team here, our marketing team. And I need to, give a big shout out to our friend Madeline. You can't see her back there, but she is running the show very efficiently. And of course, Jim over there, our grants administrator for putting a wonderful program together, and our friends at Arc Labs, of course, for the production, and of course, Meredith. Thank you for your work monitoring the comments. As I said before, this is the second of our sessions. We've got a few more coming up next week. We've got our third installment of Business Skills for Creatives, so please sign up and check that one out. I want to thank you for joining us. Remember that this session was recorded and is going to be posted to our YouTube and Facebook pages following the stream. If you have any burning questions that came to you after the opportunity, please put them in the comments and we'll do our best to get back to you with answers to those questions. Don't forget to RSVP for next week's session. We also have some opportunities through the Broward County Cultural Division to support for individual artists. We have a few calls to artists that are currently open, including an artist call for the Fort Lauderdale International Airport, a $2,500 honorarium if you're selected for our Terminal 2 Art Gallery. The deadline is July 30th. We also have a call to artists that we're helping to support with our friends over at ARLIC, which is the African American Research Library and Cultural Center, one of the county's facilities and the only one of 3 African American research libraries in the country. They have a call for artists for art and activism, and that actually comes with a $10,000 stipend and additional $2,000 for materials. The deadline is July 31st. And we're also accepting some last few applications for our Public Art and Design Committee Artist Selection Panel. That deadline is also July 30th. And we offer almost $250,000 in direct support grants to artists through the Broward County Cultural Division Artist Support Grant. The deadline for that grant opportunity is September 17th, and we've got a few application workshops coming up on August 11th. They are virtual at 10:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. So check in the comments for links to those. You can also go to our website, one of our websites, artscalendar.com, for a lot of those opportunities for grants, calls to artists. Follow us on our social media handles at Broward Arts. And reach out to us for any questions. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week. I hope you enjoy your weekend.